Good afternoon. Welcome to today's Enterprise Committee meeting. First, I will apologize for the change in time. That was from a building scheduling issue. We also have a little bit of modifications to today's agenda due to some snow issues and other constraints because of that time change. On today's agenda, first let me introduce my colleagues here joining me at the dais. We have Councilmember Abdi Warsami, Councilmember Fletcher, myself, and Kevin Reich. So we are missing today Councilmember Cano, who's the vice chair of this committee. She's on a sister city visit, and Councilmember Goodman, who is also part of this committee. But we are authorized to do the city's business. Before you today, there are 6 consent items and 2 discussion items. Let me briefly run through the consent items, and we can pull any as needed. Item number 1 is a contract with Celco, doing business as Verizon Wireless, for safety cameras around downtown. Item number 2 is a contract with Vertiba for a SaaS solution for finance portfolio management. That is the future of what we call MINS internally in the city. Item number 3 is a contract with Arete for development services. Item number 4 is a contract amendment with Swift Reach Networks, and that is part of our rolling phone notification system. It is to provide a hosted solution for rapid notification. Item number 5 is a contract amendment with Granicus for subscription-based document hosting services, and that more commonly is viewed as different kinds of newsletters and gov delivery items that the city sends out and different groups of the city send out. Item number 6 is an agreement with the University of Minnesota for short-term use of university space. And I would like to just share with my colleagues that this is part 2 of 3 of our much larger effort on working more closely together with the University of Minnesota. This is about how, without needing to go through a council process, our city departments and city meetings can be held in university spaces. I'll pause now and see if there are thoughts, questions, or changes on any of these first 6 items. Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Chair Palmisano. First, I want to comment on item number 1, just to thank MPD for working through a lot of the privacy issues that I raised. I think I'm fairly convinced that we're appropriately balancing privacy, not retaining the video unnecessarily long, not using facial recognition software, et cetera. So a lot of the conversation that we started to have a while back, I'm prepared to support this, and I appreciate everybody working through that and thinking about those issues. We'll continue working on data privacy as a body of work over the course of the year. And then I'd like to pull 4 and 5 for discussion, or just a very small amendment I want to make to those. Sure.
Thank you, Commander Gerlicher, for being here with us today. I know that you're here because of this item number 1. I'm pleased to hear that those conversations have gone well. I will then pull items 4 and 5 off of the consent and move forward items 1, 2, 3, and 6 for approval. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Those items carry. Councilmember Fletcher, items 4 and 5.
Thank you, Chair Palmisano. I just want to amend these both so that we're extending for 2 years rather than 3. I think I want to set a little bit of a sense of urgency of making sure that we're going out and looking for the best tools for this kind of communication and outreach. And so I'd be happy to support these if we could change them both to read for 2 years through June 30th, 2021.
Thank you. Questions or comments from others on the board? I have been part of conversations around this with the department director and others, and I'm supportive of this agreement. I want to point out that it is possible to end these contracts at any point in time. So if making 2 years seems like a good compromise, then that's what we will do. And I would. Are you putting that forward as an amendment?
I am, yes.
All right. All those in favor, should I do them separately, Madam Clerk?
Chair, that's completely up to you, but you could if you wanted to separate it out.
Sure. Let's just take it as 2 separate motions. So first, the contract with Swift Reach Networks, which is the rapid notification by phone system, to modify this recommendation for council action from an extension of 3 years to an extension of 2 years. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? That item carries. The second is item number 5, the contract amendment with Granicus, per Councilmember Fletcher's proposed amendment to extend the contract for 2 years. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries. Thank you. That's the first 6 items. We have 2 more, and the first is a conversation or a dialogue, perhaps, but a presentation of some work I'm really excited about. We have with us Shunu. You're going to have to help me pronounce your last name, Sarithra. And she's here to help present some of the work, the reframing of what our work effort in our study group over the past few years has been doing, and how we look forward to continuing this effort in new and important ways. This is an item about how we will work toward combating human trafficking across our city, and how it dovetails with the work that we've previously been working toward, which is to combat commercial sexual exploitation and sex trafficking. So welcome, thank you for joining us, and we're eager to hear what you have to say.
Madam Chair, Council members, thank you very much for the opportunity to provide an overview of the work that has happened in Minneapolis, but also a plan moving forward. Again, my name is Sunu Shrestha. I'm the Senior Advisor, Human Trafficking Prevention in the City Coordinator's Office. I used to say I'm fairly new, but I feel like I can't say that anymore because it's been 9 months. But I still feel like I'm learning. I'm still learning. I'm still in that learning phase. Like many of you know, the city of Minneapolis is a national leader. The city of Minneapolis has really made a name for itself in combating and addressing the issue of sexual exploitation and sex trafficking of juvenile, especially the involvement of City Attorney's Office, Minneapolis Police Department, Minneapolis Health Department, CPAID business licensing, over the last several years has really made something that was unimaginable a decade ago nationally, which is Safe Harbor for Youth Act. The Safe Harbor for Youth Act decriminalized youth who were found or are found to be involved in prostitution as criminals, and therefore directed them to receive services. Subsequently, in 2013, the City Council passed a city place to combat commercial sexual exploitation and directed the city to establish the Minneapolis Coordinating Committee to prevent juvenile sexual exploitation and sex trafficking. The Coordinating Committee was chaired by City Attorney Susan Siegel and had a lot of other participating agencies internally and also external partners. Some of the ones who I really like to highlight here are City Coordinator's Office, of course, City Attorney's Office, council members, Councilmember Palmisano herself, Minneapolis Health Department, Police Department, CPAID Business Licensing, Regulatory Services, IGR, Communications, and our other partners like Hennepin County No Wrong Door Program and UROC of University of Minnesota and other community organizations alike.
If I might just pause you briefly, I did forget to introduce other people in the room who've been a part of this work effort over time. So thank you, Ms. Siegel. Susan Siegel has been a huge part of this work, and in embarking on this work a number of years ago. We have Dan Huff here from the Health Department. He's helped with inspections and how we might forward policy that helps prevent trafficking and other kinds of business regulations. We have Michelle Hartvet, who I've been with through a lot of this work in business licensing. I see Michelle Rivero here in the audience that is kind of newly a part of this work from her new office of immigration efforts. We have always had civil rights at the table, and we're joined today by Director Velma Corbel. And we have representation from Councilmember Cano's office, who's done a lot of the on-the-ground efforts and community conversations about this in her own ward. So I just wanted to acknowledge the other people in the room before you go on to the highlights. So,
well, thank you. That's absolutely very true, that so many folks internally here in the cities have participated rigorously to come up with their plan to prevent sexual exploitation and sex trafficking. And I want to highlight a few major accomplishments that were achieved through the Minneapolis Coordinating Committee. One, the very first, was the 2013 Massage Ordinance, which actually became effective on January 1st of 2014. It provided that much needed tool to deal with illegal activities that were happening at some of the massage parlors, which included prostitution, trafficking, so on and so forth. Minneapolis Police Department, of course, has a dedicated unit, has a dedicated staff to investigate juvenile sex trafficking, utilizing victim-centered approach. Minneapolis Police Department really partners well with other community organizations, partners with City Attorney's Office in developing really creative ways to tackle the issue of juvenile sexual exploitation and sex trafficking, really from that victim-centered approach. City staff throughout the city enterprise have received training on sex trafficking and sexual exploitation, including the school-based nurses, firefighters, housing inspectors, and others. And the training was to identify signs of potential sex trafficking and also what to do in response. Likewise, the businesses here in Minneapolis, including restaurants, hotels, motels, and other businesses, have received training and information regarding juvenile sexual exploitation and sex trafficking. One of the important studies that we have produced here in the city is the one that was commissioned by Health Department. It was to assess the working conditions of adult entertainers at 17 clubs in Minneapolis, and the study was commissioned to UROC, and we really had a lot of good recommendations come out of the report, a lot of discovery and good recommendations. The City Attorney's Office has done a significant work in really approaching the issue of sex trafficking and sexual exploitation, even of adults, in a very victim-centered fashion. The one example is the pre-charge treatment-based diversion program for prostituted adults, and this is in partnership with Minneapolis Police Department, Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center, and the Family Partnership. And finally, the Super Bowl plan, the Super Bowl coordinated effort that was driven by the City of Minneapolis in partnership with the Women's Foundation of Minnesota, Hennepin County, and other community organizations, was really a big success. And it was actually drafted, translated into a plan which can be replicated by other cities who will be hosting Super Bowl in the future. And finally, the historic enactment of safe and sick time and minimum wage. Safe and sick time and minimum wage are tools to prevent especially marginalized people, low-wage workers, from further being victimized by exploiters or from being exploited and trafficked. So those are a few major highlights of the work that has happened that Minneapolis as an enterprise has produced. Moving forward, the plan is to not only focus on sexual exploitation and sex trafficking of juvenile and adults, but also labor trafficking and labor exploitation of all people. And the report that the Advocates for Human Rights did in 2016 indicated 17 incidents of labor trafficking in Minnesota, which only indicates that labor trafficking is happening in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, of course. And the recently charged case by Hennepin County is again another proof that labor exploitation is an issue here in our city as well. With that, Minneapolis wrote a citywide challenge to get a two-year funding to house senior fellow in the city coordinator's office. In addition to Minneapolis, there are two other cities, Chicago and Atlanta, who were also awarded this Pathways to Freedom grant in a nationwide challenge. The grant is, of course, for 2 years, starting in June 8, 2018, and it sunsets in June of 2020. The goal of the grant is to help the city develop a comprehensive, holistic plan to address human trafficking and exploitation, but with a focus on labor trafficking and exploitation, and provide necessary support to survivors. The tangible outcome of this process will be a policy blueprint with policy recommendations, best practices, and implementation plan, which will be delivered to the council and the city by June of 2020. Like I said, I'm still new. It's just been some months here. So my work so far has been to really engage with internal and external stakeholders. I have reached out to more than 40 organizations, including individuals in Minneapolis. Identification of new partners for this project and process is very, very crucial, because the focus earlier was so much on sexual exploitation and sex trafficking that we hadn't really thought about other organizations whose work interact with labor trafficking and labor exploitation participating in it. So with that, we have expanded our committee, our work group, and we include new organizations, individuals, and agencies in this process. To name a few: Civil Rights Department, Labor Enforcement, Neighborhood and Community Relations, Cultural Specialist, and Michelle Rivero, the Director of Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs, who is here, Fire Department, Workplace Advisory Council, Transgender Equity Council, to mention a few internally. And externally, the Advocates for Human Rights, UROC, University of Minnesota, CITOL, which is Center for Workers United in Struggle, AWOOD, Inclino, United Renters for Justice, Standpoint, the Eniton Story, the Family Partnership, Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center, and Survivor Alliance, again to mention a few. We convened a community stakeholders meeting on November 1st of 2018. 15 folks representing 25 or more organizations participated in the convening. We held 4 focus groups in November to create PSAs on human trafficking that is tailored to Minneapolis, again taking into consideration our demographics, geography, weather, and trends and patterns of exploitation and human trafficking. In January, we declared January as Minneapolis Human Trafficking and Exploitation Prevention Month. So I and the communications team at the Humanity United and Nova Foundation organization and others, we worked on a communications plan for January, because January is National Human Trafficking Awareness and Prevention Month, but we also wanted it to localize that. So we started off the month with a declaration, a mayoral proclamation declaring January as Human Trafficking and Exploitation Prevention Month. Thanks to the mayor's office and Mayor Fry for a wonderful proclamation that's very inclusive of so many encompassing issues that really are indicators of exploitation and human trafficking. We reached out to media to elevate the issue, but also to highlight the work that is happening in Minneapolis. We did 3 radio interviews with KFAI, WCCO, and Minnesota Progressive Repartee. Among these 3 radio interviews, we've reached more than 100,000 individuals in Minneapolis. We launched a trafficking web web pages, again, highlighting some of the work that has happened, but also the plan moving forward, especially the grant goals, objectives, so on and so forth. I submitted a commentary to American City and County Magazine, again, highlighting the work of the work that is happening in Minneapolis, but also making a case why the city should lead to combat the issues of exploitation and human trafficking throughout the country. The magazine's primarily audience is city, county, and state officials, and we really hope that Minneapolis will be considered a model for other cities to follow. And I also did an interview with Workday Minnesota, again talking about issues of exploitation and labor trafficking here in Minneapolis. A formation of a labor trafficking group is really, really crucial to the process, because whenever we have a human trafficking work group, we tend to focus more on sexual exploitation and sex trafficking, and that is very, very needed. But at the same time, we need a space where we can talk about labor trafficking and labor exploitation as well, with a full focus, investment, and resources. We have a contract in process with the Advocates for Human Rights to develop a city response on labor trafficking and exploitation, which will be based on the newly released labor trafficking protocol guidelines. I'm also in conversation with BP Jenkins and the Transgender Equity Council to formalize a relationship with the council, because again, there's so much crossover between our work, and again, research has shown again and again how much at a higher risk are folks from transgender community, and this work needs a more holistic, more organic approach. And I hope to formalize this relationship by subgranting $10,000 from the pot of money that I hold in my grant. Finally, we have been, City Attorney Susan Siegel, I have been in conversation with other organizations, external partners, internal partners, including CM Kano's office, in envisioning a city where we are focusing more on resources. We are focusing more on resources for victims and survivors, and from that prevention lens, and not so much focused on criminal justice approach. And we convened a meeting with external partners to apply for a 3-year funding from Nova Foundation. And Nova Foundation also happens to be one of the funders that funds my position, to sort of explore the viability of this idea, safe harbor for all, and what that would look like here in Minneapolis. So we are in the very initial phase of that conversation happening, but that is again something which we will be engaging with and engaging in as a city enterprise. Moving forward, so that was a quick highlight of some of the work that I have been engaged in. In year 2, so there's a 2-phase. The first phase is more about laying the groundwork, assessing the dynamic of the relationship and the human trafficking here in Minneapolis. But the second year will be where we will be really delving deeper and entrenching ourselves into the implementation work. Of course, we'll be starting to work on the blueprint, but also we will have opportunities where we will be testing out some of the policies, procedures that the group will be working throughout this process. So first will be to working with different city departments to adopt relevant policies and procedures, including confidentiality provisions, what's our procurement processes, outreach plans, intake procedures, and things like that. That will be very heavily focused on policies on labor trafficking and labor exploitation. And again, incorporating the language of labor trafficking in our already existing ordinances, for example, minimum wage and safe and sick time, West theft, because West theft has a direct relationship between labor trafficking. Again, developing training, especially e-training module, and coordinating training for city staff on labor trafficking, including how to recognize signs and how to respond. And finally, the tools for community engagement are around labor trafficking to ensure that city policies and procedures are culturally appropriate and that they are relevant to vulnerable communities, and those communities have key input in development of responses to labor trafficking. Engagement with survivors is really crucial to this process, and we will be engaging with survivors at every level and the marginalized communities at every level, with the hope that they will inform the kind of services and responses that we need here in Minneapolis. And again, strengthening the existing city systems will be key to prevent and end exploitation and human trafficking. Some of the examples are better system of tracking data, efficient way of sharing data, and additional enforcement tools and resources provided to different city departments, and continue to coordinate the city's work group on exploitation and human trafficking. That concludes my presentation. I'm here to answer any questions you have, but I also have Dan Hoff from Minneapolis Health Department and Michelle Herbert from CPAD Business Licensing if you have any questions for them. And also City Attorney Susan Siegel is here with us too. So I'll be here and take any questions.
I'll just pause you and see what questions we have. But as we start, Ms. Suretsa, could you help share one of the reasons why this work and moving forward on it takes a long time is because there are so many different groups, internal partners, external partners to engage on it. My understanding is that your Minnesota efforts originally came to us by way of Duluth, and that it is in part due to your strong network of relationships across the country and from the funding organization that funds this position right now, as to how we build a way to counteract human trafficking of all different types. Could you share a little bit about what that network is like and how you communicate with one another?
Yes, so thank you very much for the question, Madam Chair, council members. I was at an organization called PAVSA, Program for Aid to Victims of Sexual Assault in Duluth. I was first hired to coordinate a multidisciplinary team of different people representing different professions and different organizations, entities in Duluth, Minnesota, of course. The multidisciplinary team worked to really bring about the kind of changes that needed in each organization that were primarily interacting with victims of sexual exploitation and sex trafficking. For example, PAVSA was already seeing victims of sex trafficking and sexual exploitation who did not necessarily come to PAVSA to receive services identifying themselves as such, but rather came to PAVSA with their quote-unquote stories of sexual assault, childhood, adult sexual abuse in general. But later in the process, they would disclose to case managers, advocates that they were exchanging sex in return of something, or they were being made to trade sex for something in return by somebody else. And this was at the time when Minnesota was starting to address the issue of sex trafficking and sexual exploitation throughout the state. PAVSA happened to be one of the organizations that was primarily working to provide services to victims and survivors, and hence it became very active in this process. My my approach to this work is very relationship-based. I really believe in transparency, open communication, and really allowing survivors and victims to have a safe place where they can share their experiences. Likewise with marginalized communities, especially when I worked at PAVSA, the relationship that I had with Native organizations, the tribal governments throughout the city, or tribal governments who were nearby Duluth, we interacted with them a lot. I truly believe that this work cannot be done alone. The city coordinator's office cannot do this work alone, or the city attorney's office, or the health department, or business licensing. I think human trafficking encompasses so many different areas, and we really need a process where we are engaging with everybody in really thinking about that coordination piece and thinking about how we can be efficient in our approach through that coordination and relationship building and maintaining those relationships.
Thank you. Are there questions or thoughts from members of the committee? If not, I have a couple more. The first is, could you share a little bit about something not really in this presentation, but I know exists because they've been a part of our work group for a few years now on the sex trafficking end of things. Can you talk a little bit about how we work together and in coordination with the county on this kind of an effort?
Yes. I'm in continuous conversation with Amanda Kunchpehari, who is the program manager at Hennepin County. She manages the No Wrong Door program. But we've also been recently invited, City Attorney Susan Siegel, and I was invited by the county prosecutors to talk about our response to labor trafficking and labor exploitation. So there's a lot of interest in collaboration, and we do see that we can only be efficient if we collaborate. Knowing that we're all on the same page and knowing that we all believe in the partnership and the strength in partnership, that really gives me hope to better coordinate our work so we can really think of policies and procedures that actually will prevent rather than thinking about the services later, and which is still very crucial, but we have to be very creative in thinking about the prevention tactics.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ms. Srithra. I appreciate your work in this large lift. I understand and appreciate that this funding of this position right now is funded by a foundation and that it ends at the end of next June. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And so when we have a report or a work plan being proposed, can you share, do you know yet, will there be a budget proposal associated with that report?
That I do not know, but I can find that out and get back to you.
Thank you. Any other questions? All right. Well, it's a multi-part item, so I'll move it all together. But I will be moving forward the passage of this resolution. We've changed the scope of our work here and of our ongoing efforts. So the passage of the resolution about how we work on this and do this coordination around our city. The second is a direction to the city coordinator's office to engage the Minneapolis Coordinating Committee to expand the scope of work, to update the name, to create a cohesive year-long work plan, to convene the coordinating committee with the members of all of these different departments listed, to engage our nonprofit and community partners and stakeholders, to inform our strategies. Have I missed anything? Is everybody comfortable with that? So I'll go ahead and move that forward. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries. Thank you so much for trying to explain a kind of difficult topic in in language we can all appreciate and understand. So
Thank
good
you.
luck. Yep. The last thing we have on our agenda today is our typical city coordinator monthly update. Given some coordinating issues, we don't have a holistic view of the city coordinator's office, but Shunu is a part of that work, and we also have with us Ron Harris, who's going to speak to his own piece of that work. Mr. Harris, thank you for joining us.
Well, good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Ron Harris. I'm the Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Minneapolis. Before I begin my update, I just want to apologize on behalf of the City Coordinator's Office on our inability today to provide the City Accelerator Cohort on Inclusive Procurement application update due to some illness in our office. We'll be willing to give an update to the committee on this item at the next enterprise leadership meeting if you all desire. So first, I'll talk a little bit about what resilience means, kind of our definition, and then I'll talk a bit about the work that's been done thus far, and then I'll address some of the things that we had talked about a little bit in the media last week, the future of 100 resilient cities and that work. So the way we are defining resilience is essentially the capacity of individuals, communities, businesses, et cetera, within a city to adapt, survive, grow, no matter what the shocks or the stresses that they may see over time. The way that we're describing acute shocks are kind of the momentary things that bring our city to its knees or require our city to respond immediately. An example of an acute shock, I would argue, would be a polar vortex, right? A tornado in North Minneapolis. And I would even make the argument a police-involved shooting could be considered an acute shock. A longer-term stress would be something like aging infrastructure, certainly things due to climate change. I think a lot about silver tsunami, right? A mass retirement of the baby boomers. That's something that'll stress our system and stress our ability to adapt and respond and bounce forward over time. So some of the work that's been done thus far, back in December of 2016, before a CRO had ever been hired, we had held a day-long agenda setting workshop that really introduced the topic of resilience in our city. That included stakeholders from all across the city, and there were even some folks from out of town who really dove deep into the definition of resilience, what that means for Minneapolis, how people can kind of see themselves in that work. My predecessor did about 40 one-on-one conversations with people around the community. The people that she was talking to was a mix of institutional leaders, constituents that were recommended, and other referrals. I have since had about 25 conversations with the goal of hitting about 30 next week. Right now, we're in the process of doing what we're calling an actions inventory. And what an actions inventory is a tool that enables us to monitor and evaluate resilience via the actions that are being undertaken internally and externally. So we're going to look at all the things that we've done in recent history that the city of Minneapolis has led on. And we're also looking at all the things that have happened within the city, a small c city, that nonprofits have led on, advocates have led on, business community has led on, et cetera. And we're ranking all those actions to see what areas do we need to focus on, what areas have been left without much action, or what areas do we need to shore up some of our actions. That work won't be complete until at least about a month, but progress is moving as planned. I'm spending a lot of time reviewing and adding to a report on affordable housing resilience. A lot of this work had started in the spring of 2018. It included a summary of housing trends, the resilience lens on those trends, possible policy levers in the future, levers explored and executed by other resilient cities in their network, funding options, and groups doing this kind of work externally. Now, over the next few months, I will be completing what we're calling the preliminary resilience assessment, which includes stakeholder engagement, an overall environmental scan of city resilience, and really spending a lot of time researching Minneapolis history. How did we start as a city? How did we get to the place that we're in now? Seeing what kind of trends exist there. I'll be taking a lot of the work that's already been completed and incorporating the data into this scan. I'll also begin the process of building different stakeholder groups, flying in experts, all that kind of cool stuff. After that resilience assessment is completed, I'll begin the next phase of work, which is really a more in-depth study of discovery areas and an assessment of resilience building options in Minneapolis. So an example of a discovery area that I've been really thinking about is this is just an example. The connection between openness to immigration and rates of technology innovation and economic development. How do those two things really impact each other? I'm also thinking about, when I mentioned the silver tsunami earlier, do we need to explore if we need a catalyst of human capital to address that issue? Right? So these are just examples of the kinds of questions that we'll be asking and coming up with action steps to mitigate or address some of those things. After the resilience assessment is completed, like I said, the resilience strategy will come from all of that engagement, all of that research, all of that analysis, and the resilience strategy will essentially be a dynamic and comprehensive strategy meant to be implemented over time. So just a quick update on resilience, 100 Resilient Cities overall. 100 Resilient Cities is the arm of the Rockefeller Foundation located in New York that really funds all the resilience work within those 100 cities across the world. And Minneapolis is obviously a member of that network. It'll exist in its current form until July. At the end of July, they will be disbanding and they'll be really moving forward in resilience in a different way. And they're still working on what that looks like. But what it looks like from the foundation is they're transitioning that work along 3 initial pathways. First, there'll be a new office within the Rockefeller Foundation focused on grant making, discovery, disaster recovery work, and other projects to be determined by them in a few months. The second arm, which really intrigues me a lot, is really supporting place-based economic mobility projects or actions within U.S. cities. So they're putting a ton of money into the actions that we can start to put into cities that allow people to stay where they're at, but also climb that economic ladder without having to leave their neighborhood or leave the city or be displaced in any way. And then the third arm is that they're really building a new resilience effort within the Atlantic Council, which is a big climate change philanthropy group in the world. So the work of 100 Resilient Cities, although it's looking differently from July on, what that means for us in the city, not too much. My work will still be funded through the initial grant commitment, so that doesn't impact us at all. There was a headline in the Star Tribune that said the city had lost grant funding. The city lost absolutely nothing due to 100 Resilient Cities disbanding. If anything, we'll lose a formalized network that we had, but those relationships will still exist. The organizations that we're in contact with will still exist. We'll just function a little bit differently. And the most important piece to me is there will be no delay in my work product or my work deliverables. We're still going to stay on pace with what we were tasked to do earlier this year. And they're also committed to setting us up really, really well to make sure that we still deliver on a resilient Minneapolis strategy, that we still have access to those in the network who are interested in funding some of the action steps that we take. So they're really committed to ensuring the success of resilience here in Minneapolis. So that's just a really quick update of the work that we've done thus far and what we can look forward to moving forward. If you have any questions for me, I'm ready for you.
Mr. Harris, thank you for stepping in here at the last minute and giving us this update. Questions and comments from my colleagues, Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Chair Palmisano. I'm excited about your work. I think I've been trying to understand a little bit where resilience sort of fits into a lot of the other work that's happening. Where is it distinct from, for example, sustainability, or for example, long-range planning in CPED? Right, there are places where it seems like there's some pretty significant overlap. So I've been, I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about sort of where you think resilience work makes a unique or distinctive contribution, relative to some of those other things. And then I know the mayor's office had talked about tightening the focus to really focus on housing when they were talking about doing a search for your position, and I'm curious, what you described sounds a little broader than that, so I'm curious if that housing focus is still a part of your work, or if we've sort of broadened back out to a broader definition of resilience.
Thank you, Councilmember Fletcher and members of the committee. I think I'll answer that question in a couple different ways. The way I see resilience certainly as a subject matter, certainly as something that we need to study and that kind of thing, but I also see resilience as more of a lens and a framework. So similar to even a handful of years ago, people weren't asking questions about how do we make this more sustainable, or how does this impact the sustainability of our city? And similar to equity, how does this thing that we're doing increase our equity, or how can we make this city more equitable? The work that I plan on doing is elevating the resilience framework and the lens up to that same level, where we're asking that question, how does this make our city more resilient? How does this set our city up to both absorb the stress and those shocks, and then not only bounce back, but bounce forward, right? So a lot of the work of long-range planning, and I would even argue some of the work of sustainability, is about preventing some of those things, preventing some of the things that are gonna really impact us. What we're thinking about is less about prevention and more about forecasting. We know this is gonna come, right? There are a lot of people tasked in our city to prevent those things, but we know it's gonna come. How do we set ourselves up so that when it does come, we not only bounce back, but bounce forward? How are we better because of the shocks and the stress that we absorb? The other way I think about it is that the goal of resilience is to really de-silo subject matter, right? It's really to think about, certainly, I'm gonna think about aging infrastructure from the perspective of climate change. But I also want to think about aging infrastructure from the perspective of our most vulnerable populations or our worker community or what that means for our economy. So we're getting a little bit deeper in certainly understanding the climate change impacts, but how does this really impact people and how does this really impact a system? So when I talked about those discovery areas earlier, I mentioned, you know, the relationship between openness to immigration and technological innovations and economic development. That's tying two things, that's identifying two buckets and really using those buckets to move forward and find a solution that really meets multiple stresses or multiple shocks at one time. So resilience really elevates actions and elevates solutions that meet multiple stresses or multiple shocks. Does that make sense? Thank you.
Other questions or thoughts? All right. With that, I'd like to receive and file this report, Mr. Harris's verbal report, to our committee. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries. With that, we've completed our agenda for the day, and I adjourn this meeting. Thank you.